The Pope dies and goes to heaven. And like everyone else, he has to line up, waiting to get into the pearly gates. And so he's waiting, and he's looking at his watch, and the line isn't moving. And all of a sudden, this young woman in green scrubs and a stethoscope goes right up the line and goes to the kiosk with Peter and knocks, and the doors open, the gates open, and the trumpets blow, and gets in. And the Pope said, "This is something wrong. They need my organizational skills around here." Goes, knocks on the kiosk and said, "Peter, you know me. I'm your successor, the Vicar of Christ. And I'm waiting in line. What's happening? The line isn't moving, and this doctor appears to have got into heaven in front of everybody else." And Peter says, "Well, actually, that was God. She thinks she's a doctor." So the gospel today is a bit like that joke. In the story, it needs both the worldly and the otherworldly. And with that privilege of doctors and clergy who think they have an inside track to God in heaven, and we can skip the line. And we joke about that. And we're kind of afraid. That joke is disguising our fear of what heaven, if there is a heaven, what that might be like. I love my Delta Sky Priority miles because I can get ahead of the line and I can get on the plane and put my luggage in the overhead compartment before everybody else gets there. So I'm worried about the equality that may be present, that I won't be able to use my sky miles in heaven. And the parable that Jesus tells, if we see it rather like a Punch and Judy show, imagine Jesus telling that to a group of peasants. And like the Punch and Judy show, they're cheering the poor guy Lazarus who's lying at the gate, "Yay!" And the guy in purple and fine linen who's feasting sumptuously, "Boo." And so this story is a kind of joke about the human condition. And what are we to make of it? And it's interesting that the context, the rich guy is a religious leader. He's a Sadducee. And the Sadducees were the aristocratic temple authorities. And there's a kind of double edge to this story because the Sadducees don't believe that there's an afterlife. They believe that one is rewarded or punished in this life. And it's kind of convenient because if you live your life the way that you really want to live it with no eternal consequences, then that's okay. And, we have a lot of Christians that don't believe in heaven or an afterlife or a hell. And today's story is disturbing because it kind of forces us to look at what that means. Is it just convenient that we don't believe in the eternal consequences of our actions today? And that's kind of what Jesus was getting at in this story. The story, the figure of Lazarus, it's the only time in a parable that Jesus gives a name to a character. So Lazarus is actually very important. And he is the symbol of all that is painful and tragic and kind of alone in humanity. And he is kind of the butt of all the dark side of what it means to be human. And it's interesting that it's the animals. We think that image of the dogs coming and licking his sores. He has no intimacy except the animals who come and pay attention to him. And he's kind of a figure that is invisible. He is ignored. He is at the gate of the rich man and who's waiting for the sops to come out of the window. And in those days, you didn't eat with forks and knives. You ate with your hands. So your greasy hands that are full of juicy meat, juices, you would wipe on clods of bread and throw them out the window. And that's what Lazarus was waiting for. And so he becomes a kind of image of this tragic part of humanity that is ignored, does not know intimacy, and is desperate. I remember when I was working in AIDS in the 80s, we had stories of young people being completely devoid of human touch. The laying on of hands in church, the blessing, was often the only time people with AIDS got touched. Stories of hospitals that would leave food outside. And so Lazarus becomes this kind of prototype of that broken humanity. And it's interesting that this story is one of the most depicted in medieval art because of what it represents. And that stories of lepers and ministries to lepers, that Lazarus becomes this larger-than-life character. So it becomes really important in a kind of theological reflection of what it means to be human. And then this ironic turning of the tables, where in the afterlife, there's a way in which the people who ignored Lazarus suddenly see him in a different light. And it's interesting that hell and heaven in this story aren't separated. You know, it's not on the 10th floor and the first floor. They actually can see each other, and that memory and identity are still present. And the rich Sadducee actually sees Lazarus, and there's a kind of conversion in the story because he breaks out of his own self-absorption. He says, could we somehow tell my brothers, is there a way to get a message to them that this is a different way of living? Maybe they can be saved from this torment that I'm seeing. So part of the torment is a realization, oh my God, what have I been doing all my life that I haven't seen this person? And the long-term consequences of what that's doing. And I think the theme of today's readings is about the connection between what we do now and the long-term consequences of those decisions. I was looking at the commentary on the parables by William Barclay, who's a wonderful scholar, New Testament scholar, and he says this: the rich Sadducee he calls Dives, D-I-V-E-S. What was the sin of Dives? He had not ordered Lazarus to be removed from his gate. He had made no objection to his receiving the bread that was flung away from his table. He did not kick him in the passing. He was not deliberately cruel to him. The sin of Dives was that he never noticed Lazarus, that he accepted him as part of the landscape and simply thought it perfectly natural and inevitable that Lazarus should lie in pain and hunger while he wallowed in luxury. As someone said, it was not what Dives did that got him into jail, it was what he did not do that got him into hell. And in the end, it never even dawned on him that it had anything to do with him. Barclay also makes a couple of important points that help us challenge the notion that we're all okay in this life. And the point of the parable that comes across from the conversation between Abraham and the rich Sadducee was the idea that you can have anything you wanted, but there was a price to pay for it. You choose to set your heart on worldly things, now you must pay the price. Barclay quotes George MacDonald, who tells a story of a local draper who grew rich by keeping his thumb on the tape measure every time he worked with a client. So what he did was he became rich and well known and respected in the community, but he was a cheat. So there was a price. That was the price that he paid. What are the long-term consequences of the decisions that we make? And the Old Testament lesson is also about the relationship between the now and the future. And it's a kind of rather amazing story. Here you have Jeremiah in a war zone. He's in prison because people didn't like his sermons. He's preaching doom and gloom. A foreign army is about to invade, and God tells him to buy a property. And there's a lot of background to how deals were made in those days. It was probably property that belonged to his clan, so he was entitled to buy it. And there's a hard copy that is sealed that proves the deal was done, and there's an open copy that he can work with. But the point of the story is nobody in his day would have been buying property. It would be like deciding we're going to buy property in Syria. Why would we want to do that? It's economically senseless to invest in a country that is falling apart. And that's the context in which Jeremiah buys this land. But it's about the future. It's about that God is promising that one day people would till those lands and live in those houses, and that there would be hope. There would be a future. So the connection between the present and the future not yet. And what we do as people of faith to be able to stand out from the crowd to make those decisions. So both the stories in the Old Testament and then the parables is really about how the decisions we make today, how it affects long term. Where are we in relation to that? And I think about the affects the changing economic landscape of the United States in, say, the last 30 years. And I think of places like Detroit and mining communities where there is a change of energy. There is a whole different approach to clean energy. And communities were simply not prepared for those changes, either in their schools, in their decision-making. Decisions were made, and you get communities like Poughkeepsie, where IBM decides to pull out, and hundreds of thousands of people are impacted by that decision. And the idea of Lazarus lying at the gate receiving the sops becomes the model for a kind of social Darwinism that is very much a part of the economic landscape of this country. And the question is, those of us who have vision and resources and compassion and realize the long-term implications of that, what do we do about it? Investing, doing the audacious thing, investing in property, in employment, in schools. It was very interesting. I watched Leon Botstein's very challenging sermon last week and the Q&A, and how he was reflecting on the failure of government. He was reflecting on the failure of religion. People aren't coming to church to be challenged. They're coming to church to be comforted or reassured in their own kind of economic and political systems. He talked about universities becoming banks, more concerned about their own long-term survival than how do we discover things and change the world for good for everybody. And I found his comments as a president of a leading college, and Bard is, in its own small way, trying to do amazing things with high schools and investing in parts of the world that are struggling with the kind of changes that I'm describing. They are the Lazarus at the gate, receiving the sops. And how do we move forward? I want to give a practical and modern example of how that might look like. And part of my European vacation, I went to the Netherlands to visit some friends. And I was very keen to see the work that the Netherlands are doing on water control. I was talking to Nancy about this because of her Dutch connections. And what was amazing was there was this terrible flood in 1953 that wiped out a whole section of the Netherlands, something like 2,000 people were killed, 200,000 head of cattle lost. And it was this major crisis for a country that is largely under sea level. And what they did was they decided, instead of just building the dikes and supporting those communities that would have the resources to protect themselves, they decided to go into this bold adventure. And there's an area called Sand Creek, the Kramer, and the Gravelingen, that's known collectively as the Delta Works, where there was this enormous investment in water control, and they built these huge dikes that cost billions of dollars at the time. And it took a generation to complete it. And it was this enormous investment in water control in a country that's largely under sea level. And what was amazing was that not only was this a bold adventure about investing in the future, but it actually began to pay for itself because they were able to reclaim land. And they were able to have the confidence to do farming and do the kind of expansion that the country needed to do. And the Dutch, in their very practical way, became one of the leaders in the world in water control. And they talk about this Delta Works area as one of the eighth wonder. It's the eighth wonder of the world now. And that's a very practical example about how people with intelligence and resources and the moral commitment to invest in the now that will affect the future, that I believe these lessons are all about. So what does that mean for us here at St. Peter's and here in this community as we look around? One of the things that has been a kind of learning curve for me is the way in which our outreach partners, people like Richard Witt and the Duchess agencies that's working with many of the marginalized, the invisible that we don't usually see, these partners have helped us to see the Lazarus at our gate. They've helped us to see the faces and the stories and the families that are struggling. And next week, everybody has an opportunity, thanks to Lois Mander and her wonderful work that she's doing with our St. Peter's Promises. I think we have over 200 people now coming. But it's a wonderful way that we see Lazarus. We see the face of this kind of marginalization that many people still don't see. And I think it's this wonderful adventure not only to come to terms with what that chasm is about. It's a huge chasm in this community and in this country. And the faith community is doing something about it. And my imagination is we will have, maybe 250 people under a tent at the back of the church next Saturday. How wonderful. But it's not an end. That's not an end. It's a beginning. And I believe that the skills and the experience and the commitment and the compassion of the people under that tent could make a huge difference to this community. A huge difference. And that what we do today has enormous moral, ethical, economic consequences for the future. And I hope that these stories, as we delve into the experience of the ancestors and the jokes that mask the fear, the privilege, the opportunity, that encourage us to take a position, to take a stand, to act courageously, to do the audacious thing, the socially unexpected thing that will actually change the course of history. So lots to think about. Amen.